welcome to Lecture 12 on population ecology. These are your common misconceptions for ecology, and there's quite a few of them. Here's the first one. Populations exist in states of either constant growth, so J-shaped growth, or decline, straight down, depending upon their position in the food chain. So that means that organisms, populations of organisms never level out. They're either moving up or moving down. Okay. The second would be that density-dependent reduction factors are biotic, or living, and density-independent factors are abiotic, or non-living. The third, populations increase until limits are reached. Then they crash and go extinct. The fourth, plants are dependent on people, not vice versa. Energy is not lost in trophic transfer. In other words, as animals eat plants, there's no energy lost. So watch the video and see if you can correct any of these misconceptions. When we look at ecology, we're going to be talking about both biotic factors and abiotic factors. So this is the broadest look that we are going to be doing at our world of living things. For population ecology, though, we're really going to focus on what are the factors that affect the growth of a single population. And population curves vary depending upon reduction factors that are occurring in the environment or between organisms. And those curves can be J-shaped, which is exponential growth, or they can be S-shaped, which is a logistic growth, where you have a leveling off that occurs. Now, for exponential growth, all organisms will grow exponentially in the absence of reduction factors. So new populations, just getting a foothold in an environment, often begin to grow this way. But eventually, they level out. They level out because they limit one another, because there's just too many of them, or they get limited by something else. And you can see what that looks like, a leveling off. Now that leveling off, we're going to call that the carrying capacity. So the carrying capacity for a given population is however many of those individuals that a particular environment can sustain indefinitely. Carrying capacity itself can shift for populations. That number can move, and that's because the environment's always changing. So there are adjustments that are made over time. Carrying capacity is not a fixed number. To show you an example of this, I'd like to look at the monarch butterfly. The monarch butterfly is an organism that overwinters in Mexico. So they all move down to Mexico for the winters, and then they come back to their breeding grounds. They really kind of distribute all throughout the United States on their way back up. And one of the interesting things that's happening with these guys is that they've had boom and bust years. When you're looking at population growth, it's really important to look at the big picture. We don't want a snapshot. We don't want 1 or 2 years of data. You know, we want 10 years of data. We want to see what are the trends that are occurring over time. And the monarch butterfly is a good one to look at. One, because numbers are in fact declining. But if you were to just look at one given year, let's say 96, 97 year, you would say, boy, populations are doing just fine. If you were to look at just 2 years, let's say 04 to 05, okay, pretty low, but look, they're rebounding the following year. And you'd say, okay, they're doing just fine. But now you look at the spectrum from 1994 to 2013, and you draw a trend line. And what you can see is that, yes, in fact, populations are dwindling. And in fact, this year, in 2013, they actually occupied the smallest area ever in the history of recording monarch butterflies. There's a number of reasons for this, similar reasons for honeybee declines. Genetically modified organisms, that's something we're going to be talking about in class. Pesticide use, habitat destruction is a really big one. The big picture here is that when we're looking at population data, we need to look at trends. We need to look at long-term data. What we're going to look at now are all of those factors that reduce populations. So if all populations grow exponentially to begin with, what in fact is leveling them off? And one of the categories of things that are leveling them off is something called density-dependent reduction factors. These are simply reduction factors that are dependent upon the number of individuals within a population. So with the monarch butterflies, if they begin to grow exponentially and grow and grow and grow and grow and grow, eventually they will limit each other. Their density is causing the reduction in population. And it can be things like lack of inorganic nutrients for plants, light, if you're thinking about plants as well, shelter from predators. In the case of monarch butterflies, it would be overwintering habitat. So limiting factors is one of the things that reduces population size. It's a really common factor for reduction. Another example of a density-dependent reduction factor is predation. Now, for these organismal interactions, we're going to be looking at whether they have a positive influence or a negative influence or no influence, which would be symbolized by a 0. So in predation, obviously, one of the populations is benefiting, one of the populations is not benefiting. So let's look at some examples of this. With predator-prey interactions, sometimes when you have a predator that only consumes 1 or maybe 2 prey items, you end up with this codependence or coevolution, where you have prey and predators that are really dependent upon each other, and their cycles are indicative of this. If you look at prey over time, so something like the lynx and the hare, you can see that the hare is going to increase and decrease and increase and decrease. And that's going to be right around its carrying capacity. It's going to be the noise right around there. The predator mirrors the prey item. So as prey increase in number, predators start increasing in number because they have more food. But as prey begin to decrease, then predators begin to decrease because they have less food. And so they go through these cycles up and down, mirroring one another over time. When there's a high degree of specificity in terms of predator-prey, you see these cycles appear. And we're going to work with some real-life examples in class. One of the things that predation leads to over time is coevolution. Coevolution has been happening on Earth since the very beginning of time. When organisms consume one another, what happens is that the prey ends up being more cryptic or developing toxins that would deter the predator, and the predator in turn produces resistance against those toxins or becomes faster or sneakier in terms of capturing more prey. And so what coevolution is when species exert pressure on one another to change. And the way that it's linked with predation is just that when you have this high degree of specificity in terms of food choice, those are very dependent on one another, and they're causing change in one another. So speed for the lynx, coloration patterns for the hare, and so evolution ties into this very closely, these predator-prey relationships. In these examples that you have right here, you have a moth that looks like bird poop. Here you have a cheetah that is very, very cryptic for the grasses that it lives in. You have artificial eye spots here. Those aren't actually eyes. You have basically a seahorse that looks like a piece of algae. So you have all these creative things that have happened over time because of predator-prey interactions that lead to coevolution. So what happens to organisms in the absence of a predator? Well, in the absence of a predator, what happens is you have density-dependent reduction factors that start to limit the population. So those limiting factors, right? So the limiting factors take over versus a predator. And that just can be very, very detrimental to the environment. Let me show you an example. There's a small island where reindeer were introduced in around 1910. And this was someone's pet project. They thought it'd be a good idea to introduce reindeer because it would be fun and they would look pretty on the island. Well, what happened to those reindeer over the course of years is that their population exploded. That is a J-shaped curve. That is exponential growth. There were no predators on the island. And what happened is that as this population exploded, they began to run out of food, for one thing, run out of habitat. They actually changed the scenery, the habitat, so that food items weren't able to grow as well. And what happened is that that led to a crash. So that's another option. It's not always that J-shaped curves level off in this nice S-shaped curve. Sometimes they increase and they crash. And in this example, because of a lack of predators, they altered the environment so much that they actually reduced their own carrying capacity on this particular environment. So the sustainability of them on the island is not as good as if there was a predator. Because what predators do is they limit the growth of the population. They limit each other as they go through predator-prey cycling. So instead of being up at a carrying capacity up here, they've crashed and they're way, way, way down here. So it's dangerous to not have predators. Another density-dependent reduction factor is competition. Competition occurs when you have something called niche overlap. And what niche overlap is when two different populations, and sometimes two different species, have very similar places that they live, things that they eat, similar hiding habitat. When those are very, very similar, that's a high degree of niche overlap. They're just very similar to one another. And so, you know, they're competing for food and they're competing for habitat in the same places. And so that competition can be really, really, really intense. When we think of competition, we often think of a race where someone wins and someone loses. Well, that's not the case in ecology. Competition is always a negative-negative. Both lose. Because if we go back to that example of two populations where there's a high degree of niche overlap, well, if they're going to coexist, they're going to be at lower numbers than if one of those populations didn't exist at all. So it's a negative-negative in terms of competition. We're going to talk about the solution to that, and that's niche partitioning, but let's do a little bit more on competition first. There's something called the competitive exclusion principle, and if you have two populations, could be the same species, could be different species, and they have really similar niche overlap, what happens is that if you put them together, one will die and one will live. And so it's competitive exclusion. And so that's how the principle goes. But in real life, what ends up happening is that instead of one dying and one living, there's adaptation that takes place. This is why we have so much biodiversity on Earth. There's lots and lots of niche overlap on this planet. And if competitive exclusion always ruled, we would have far fewer species. What they do is they partition the resources. They use adaptations to find out little ways around the niches so that there's not so much overlap, so that both can actually coexist. This is a good thing. We want species to coexist because that brings up biodiversity in our world, that makes our planet more stable, and it makes the Earth healthier. So if you take something like paramecium and you do an experiment, you've got two different subspecies of paramecium and you put them in the same flask. Here they are grown in separate flasks, here they are in the same flask. You can see that there's a drop-off there, and one of them wins and one of them loses. But that's unusual in the natural world. In the natural world, adaptation is used. So let me give you an example of something that happens right here in the Pacific Northwest. So if you go down to Larrabee State Park, you'll be able to see what we call zonation of barnacle species. Way, way, way up high behind the tide line, way up on the rocks, you're going to see some of these really small barnacles, and as you move towards the tide line, they're going to get bigger. And that's because they're actually two different types of barnacle. Now these barnacles, the niche overlap is super tight. They live in the same place, they eat the same things, they reproduce in the same ways. So competitive exclusion says one should lose and one should win, and that's not the case. This is a negative-negative interaction, and there's something called niche partitioning that happens to remedy this situation, to make it so that both can survive. And here's how it works. So this is niche partitioning. We have the small barnacles up here because they have an adaptation to go ahead and stay wet longer. The higher you are in the tide line, the more you are out of the water. Tide recedes. These guys are out longer than these guys. So what they have is an adaptation. They have these little doors that they can close to seal themselves off when the water recedes. And when the water comes back up, they open up and their feeder is in there, and that feeder feeds in the water column. So these guys have an adaptation to be able to resist drying out. These guys don't, but they're far superior at consuming food because they're bigger and they can reach higher into the water column. So what happens when these little guys, when their larvae settle out on the rock, some of them, it's going to be random. They settle all over the place, but the ones down here die off because they're outcompeted for food by the larger ones. And if the larger ones settle up here, they inevitably will, then they will die out because they dry out. And so you have this literally a line where you have small barnacles and large barnacles. And that line, when you see that in the intertidal, is showing that there is intense competition going on there, really intense competition. And this is niche partitioning so that they can both survive, albeit at lower numbers. It's a negative-negative, but they can still both survive. You can see this in land plants. Land plants do this with root systems. That's one way that they do this at different depths to access water and nutrients. Okay, so those were density-dependent reduction factors that level off that J-shaped curve, turn it into an S-shaped curve. There are other things, though, that can do that, and these are independent reduction factors. So regardless of how many there can always be things like storms or frosts that come through and randomly kill off part of the population and reduce that population. We learned this as genetic drift when we were looking at evolution. And so there are independent reduction factors as well that we need to consider. So looking at a J-shaped curve that then turns into an S-shaped curve, this environmental resistance is what we've been looking at. That's density-dependent reduction factors as well as density-independent reduction factors. There's one thing that's missing, though. Some type of interaction that we haven't talked about that needs to be addressed. And that interaction is called symbiosis. So any of the interactions where there's a plus sign, so predation, as well as some of the symbioses, that is a lift that can occur in carrying capacity. Symbioses are long-term relationships between different species. They coexist together to bring up both of their carrying capacities if it's a mutualism. So we're going to look through these and look at what it does to J-shaped curves. The first example I'd like to look at is a cellular mutualism, and then we'll look at a behavioral mutualism. For a mutualism, it's a plus-plus. So for both of the species involved, there's a lift in carrying capacities. This is a long-term relationship. This particular relationship has been going on for millions of years. So this is a long-term relationship. And the example I want to show you is the example of corals. If you look at something like a stony coral, you're going to see within, that's embedded in the top 2 millimeters of the rock, that calcium carbonate rock, you're going to see these little polyps, and they're tiny. Well, what those polyps are is they're basically like small anemones, and they are the ones that are creating that rock. They're very, very important for ecosystems, marine ecosystems in the world. And so these little coral polyps, or little tiny anemones, they're animals. And they're heterotrophic. Look at the mouth. So they've got a mouth right there, and they feed themselves from the water column. They have sticky tentacles, just like anemones do. They literally are small anemones. And so what happens is that because they live in waters that tend to not have very many nutrients in them, so when you go to subtropical and tropical locales, you do a little scuba diving or maybe some snorkeling. We like to do that because the water is so clear, it's so beautiful, so blue. But what that means for the organisms living there is that there's not a lot of food in the water. So if you're an animal that eats with its mouth and you're not able to move, you're sessile, you're stuck, you're embedded in the rock, it's a part of you. How are you going to eat? There's not enough food in the water column. So what happens, what has happened over millions of years, is a cellular mutualism, where inside of these coral polyps, all of these little yellow dots in the tentacles are algae. So this animal hosts algae, and the algae photosynthesize and give the animal sugar. And the animal gives the algae not only a place to live, but also nitrogen and phosphorus, so that the plants, or the protists, can make their DNA and their proteins and ATP. Okay, and so this is an algae-animal relationship, a mutualism that is mutually beneficial, and it's intracellular. Another example of a behavioral mutualism, so not intracellular this time, but behavioral, is the relationship between the shrimp and the goby. And these guys live on coral reefs, within the vicinity of coral reefs. And so what happens is, because the goby lives in an area on a reef where real estate prices are extremely high, okay, there's hardly any available niches on a reef because biodiversity is just boom, it's just exploding, right? Tons of biodiversity. So what the goby has done is befriended these shrimp, and the shrimp build a burrow. So they dig out a burrow, and the goby get to live with the shrimp. They actually live together in the burrow, two totally different species. And so obviously that's a huge benefit to the goby, because the goby can go ahead and escape predators. So fantastic for the goby, really, really a good deal. So what does the shrimp get out of it? It's a mutualism. The shrimp gets an early detection system, an early warning system for predators. So the goby acts as a watch, and the shrimp lays an antennae on the goby while it's foraging for food. And if the goby does a special little dance, then they both know they need to slip back into that burrow. So the shrimp doesn't have to spend as much energy on watching out for predators if it has a goby. And so this is a behavioral mutualism. Here's a shrimp with two goby, and so sometimes they can link up in more than a pair. Parasitism is the next type of symbiosis. Symbiosis is an umbrella term. And so we've got mutualism, we've got parasitism, and we have commensalism. For parasitism, in this instance here, it basically acts like predation. So it's a plus-minus, just like predation is. So you've got a plus-minus relationship here. But it's different than predation. In predation, you have the predator killing the prey. And that's very unusual in a parasitic relationship. In parasitic relationships, usually the parasite just slowly sucks the energy from the host, but it doesn't kill it. Because usually, like if this protozoa killed its host, then it would die as well. So it's on the scale of predation, but it's considered a symbiosis because it's such a long-term relationship. And what about commensalisms? Well, commensalisms are relationships where one of the species benefits and the other one is neither harmed nor benefits. So we have a +0 relationship. In this example, I'm showing cattle egrets and livestock. And the egret stands on the back of the livestock waiting for the livestock to kind of dig up grubs. Okay, and so as the livestock feed, they're pulling up soil, unearthing soil, and that turns the soil over so that the egret can swoop down and consume whatever grubs have come up. So clearly the egret is benefiting the livestock, not really benefiting or getting harmed. Okay, that concludes our lecture on population ecology.